In The song you just heard was the Ave Verum Corpus, and I played it like this using simple chords and a piano and just my voice, so you could hear it like you're used to hearing people perform songs they've written at the Bluebird Cafe or in a writer's circle. It might seem very strange to say this, but Mozart was not that different from many of us songwriters. In fact, I'll tell you something that shocked me recently when I discovered it. Mozart co-wrote another opera with 4 other guys the year before he wrote the Magic Flute. It contained all the same basic elements and ideas, both musically and textually. And do you know what it was called? Does anyone know what it was called? Any guesses? It's not a surprise because it was only discovered in 1994. It's called the Philosopher's Stone. And it wasn't discovered until 1994. The Philosopher's Stone. So what was Mozart doing co-writing an opera named after the symbolic goal of spiritual alchemy 1 year before writing the Magic Flute with his librettist and Masonic brother, Schikaneder? And why were all of Mozart's co-writers on the Philosopher's Stone the same people who took all the leading roles in the Magic Flute? What were they trying to do? What ideas were they working with? And why, nearly 4 years after the Magic Flute was premiered, was Freemasonry banned in Austria for 100 years? In order to understand what Mozart was up to, we really need to see this in a larger context. History must be separated from mythology so that we can more clearly study the myths and understand their symbolic values. When mythology is taken literally, at face value, and becomes history, it quickly becomes impossible to have a rational discussion about anything. And faith becomes a rotten substitute for critical thinking and for the search for the truth, whatever it may be. Thus, in order to understand the truly profound value of Mozart's Masonic music, we must destroy any illusions that have been built up around who Mozart actually was. Despite the romantic desire of many non-Masonic Mozart scholars and authors to see Mozart as some kind of magical personality, a kind of Harry Potter of music, actually, Mozart was a pretty normal guy. He spent most of his time being an incredible musician and not much else. This is pointed out in a brilliant paper by Brother Peter Paul Fuchs, 32 Degrees, titled A Resolution of Mozart and Freemasonry, Enlightenment and the Persistence of Counter-Reformation. So there's Mozart as a normal guy. I love the internet. If I credit this, and I put in my footnotes, I'm going to have to credit the internet for that one. Fuchs's argument is brilliant and simple and clears up a lot of misperceptions about Mozart by putting him in the proper context. As Fuchs points out, Mozart did not write the texts of his librettos. How then could he be personally involved in the construction of the symbolic expressions of these great works? Surely putting a song or two in E-flat, which has a key signature containing 3 accidentals, a Masonically significant number, or having rhythmic patterns show up here and there in groups of 3 or 5, isn't all there is to it. Brother Fuchs demonstrates that the matter is further complicated by the fact that Mozart was a devout, committed Roman Catholic for his entire life, and he lived during the time of the Counter-Reformation, which was a movement largely inspired by and dominated by the Jesuits. As Fuchs says, quote, much of Mozart's career took place during the period when the Jesuits had been suppressed by the Holy See. The extent to which the Jesuits created the Counter-Reformation cannot be overstated. They controlled the theological speculations of the Council of Trent and created the whole culture of the Counter-Reformation and its artistic expression, the Baroque. Part of Mozart's ability to creatively engage the tension with this archaism is that it perhaps always had that archaic feature, even when he used it in its initial force. Perhaps there are aesthetic reasons for considering that his Jesuit Baroque style, with its unsubtle propaganda moorings, always had a put-on quality. Now that may be a little heady. I read this massive paper this guy wrote. It was stuff like that the whole time, so let me translate that. What Fuchs is hinting at but not fully saying here is that Mozart used elements of the Jesuit-influenced Baroque style in his music in a way that often was intentionally tongue-in-cheek. Having read all of Mozart's letters, I can also see that he did so knowing that in the context of his times, he was putting on or making a mockery of the Jesuits as well as the monarchy. Anyone who has seen the movie Amadeus, or who is aware of Mozart's use of humor and sarcasm, will instantly understand the sublime genius of this man when it is seen that these compositions were often played for the people that he was directly making fun of, right in front of them. And he got away with it. The Jesuits were only reinstated by Pope Pius VII in 1814, a full 23 years after Mozart's death. One of their great admirers was the Empress Maria Theresa, the mother of Marie Antoinette, thought by most scholars to be the inspiration behind the Queen of the Night character in the Magic Flute. At first, this character appears to represent motherly love and divine feminine affection, and sends 3 ladies to save Tamino, I'm always pronouncing his name right, Tamino, from a huge serpent. Her daughter, Pamina, has been kidnapped by Sarastro, an evil sorcerer, something to have been modeled after Cagliostro, or the Prospero character from The Tempest. In the second act, Sarastro, this evil magician, is revealed to be the high priest of Isis and Osiris, and in fact is a wonderful, benevolent, wise man who leads an ancient brotherhood that initiates Tamino into their mysteries to prepare him to be worthy to marry Pamina. By the end of the opera, the Queen of the Night is transformed into an arch-villain who desires to destroy the temple. Maria Theresa, our real-life Queen of the Night, was fond of the Jesuits, and not surprisingly, hated Freemasonry, as it posed a direct threat to the tyrannical power of the monarchy. The parallels are clear. At first, leadership is needed in a time of chaos, but over time, as order emerges, the savior often becomes a tyrant. It has always been this way with kings and queens. Pamina, as her daughter, represents the people who have been taken or kidnapped by the Brotherhood, which is to say the common people at this time who are being initiated into the mystery traditions, and as a result, we're starting to understand personal development and critical thinking skills, and we're coming to have no use for kings and queens. Maria Theresa's younger son, Leopold II, ironically, was rumored to have risen to the 18th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, that of the Rose Croix, and is thought by many to be portrayed by the character Tamino. In the Magic Flute, Tamino must undergo trials of wisdom to become worthy to be Pamina's husband. This directly references the idea that kings must always be approved and installed by the Brotherhood, and if they are not, like the Pharaoh Akhenaten so many millennia before, they can be removed. This concept was holding true in Catholic Europe with the divine right of kings, but the existence of Freemasonry and the Protestant Reformation at this time provided a competing brotherhood that served the same function, and that is the crux of the matter. Sadly, Leopold II was only on the throne from 1790 to 1792 and was replaced by Francis II. I thought I was looking at a space alien when I pulled that picture. Francis II was very paranoid that Freemasonry was working against him and suppressed the order. The chemical wedding that could have been arranged between an initiated wise king, Leopold, and his people was not to be. It is useful to point out that Francis II's aunt, Marie Antoinette, had her head chopped off in 1793. Oh, wait. There we go. Thank you. Amidst the French Revolution, whose rallying cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité was strikingly similar to the motto of the Scottish Rite, which had a Grand Lodge in France, practicing the 25-degree rite of perfection since at least the 1760s. In his argument, by placing Mozart in this Counter-Reformation context and pointing out the complexity of his Catholic faith, Fuchs carefully and brilliantly demonstrates, deconstructs the notion that Mozart was any kind of musical Gandalf figure, and leaves the reader with a kind of assurance that despite this fact, Mozart was a great man and Mason, and lived in a very turbulent time. The point is also made that Freemasonry allowed Mozart to be as Catholic as he wanted to be, and he had the ability to sit in the lodge with men of other creeds and have enlightened discussion. Indeed, this melting pot atmosphere of enlightened discussion and philosophical inquiry also had a profound effect on Mozart's music. That's actually a painting that is purported to have Mozart in the bottom right corner in a lodge in Vienna. If someone reading this brilliant paper by Brother Fuchs simply stopped there, they would be missing an incredible thing, which is the centerpiece of my presentation today. Despite the fact that he was a normal guy, Mozart was still a musical alchemist. He just did everything with the power of his intuition. He didn't even need to consciously understand every nuance of the times in order to explode forth with unstoppable inspiration. The world is lucky that he was surrounded by Freemasons who understood his genius, cultivated it, and created containers and structures for his compositions to infuse, like carefully prepared alchemical elixirs of high art, available for the whole world to ingest for centuries. Indeed, some have commented that his music got even better after he became a Mason. There's no doubt that his Masonic period also happened to be the period of his greatest masterpieces. This doesn't prove anything, of course, but it's quite astounding when parts of the Magic Flute are compared to the Philosopher's Stone. The way the co-writing relationships happened is very curious. In 1789, Emanuel Schikaneder, if anyone speaks German and would like to correct my accent, please afterwards come talk to me, because I know I'm screwing it up. Emanuel Schikaneder, an actor, singer, playwright, and composer, and Freemason, assumed artistic management of a theater company called, I'm going to try this, Theater auf der Weiden, is that right? In Vienna. In order to attract a larger audience, he took it upon himself to create a series of fairy tale operas based on a collection of fairy tales published in 1786 by Christoph Martin Wieland. One of his partners was another Freemason, Karl Ludwig Gesecki. And together they began to put together co-writing teams that, for all intents and purposes, closely resembled the kinds of group writing sessions that now happen commonly in film, TV, and in the music world. The atmosphere of these writing sessions, of which Mozart was a member, was described in 1794 by an anonymous author thusly: with the Beneficent Dervish and with the Philosopher's Stone, both operas at the time, several individuals composed them at the same time. One works on these operettas like one builds a house. It cannot be denied that this is the very best way when an opera has to be created in a short amount of time. Or if you live in Nashville, we need you to get that song finished and demoed by tomorrow. We'll miss our window to pitch it to Brad Paisley. I think some of you in this room might actually know what that's like. Add to this the fact that there is a massive controversy over whether there's another third co-writer, Karl Ludwig Gesecki, on the libretto of the Magic Flute. And you might as well imagine these guys sitting around in a studio on Music Row, because they really did go through a lot of the same stuff back then, only they didn't have copyright, so they were all starving. The thing that makes these songs a little different than what we have now is their highly esoteric symbolism, laid over otherwise normal fairy tales. Like a true Masonic allegory, these operas overlay a set of symbols directly on top of a previously existing story that allow for two completely different sets of meanings to emerge. And another for those, meanings to emerge. One level of meaning for those who are just there to be entertained, and another for those with eyes to see. Oscar Wilde, who wrote The Importance of Being Earnest, a play I still haven't seen, once said, and I don't think I'm going to see it because I like being able to say that. Maybe I'll see it one day. Oscar Wilde once said, "All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril." This cuts to the heart of what a Masonic allegory really is, and provides a context for understanding these operas as Masonic works, operating on multiple levels and based on source materials that, for all intents and purposes, could have been equally effective had they been taken from Aesop's Fables or Star Wars. Further solidifying the connections already made, you must remember that Mozart's co-writers on the Philosopher's Stone all took leading roles in the Magic Flute. J.B. Hinneberg both conducted and co-wrote the Philosopher's Stone and conducted during the first performance of the Magic Flute. Benedict Schack both co-wrote and played the role of Astromonte in the Philosopher's Stone and played the role of Tamino in the Magic Flute. Franz Xavier Gerl both co-wrote and played the role of Euphronte in The Philosopher's Stone and took the part of Sarastro in The Magic Flute. Emmanuel Schikaneder both co-wrote and sang the role of Lubano in The Philosopher's Stone, commissioned the work, wrote the libretto, took the part of Papageno, and was the original promoter and provided the venue for The Magic Flute. Eat your heart out, Tyler Perry. And let's not forget about Giesecke, who may have been a ghostwriter for Schikaneder. We've seen a glimpse of how the specific works of the Magic Flute and the Philosopher's Stone were intentionally created as Masonic allegory by Masons for the public in a time where public enlightenment was seen as a threat to the powers of church and state. It got so messy. Rulers like Francis II, the nephew of Marie Antoinette and the grandson of Empress Maria Theresa, who is symbolized by the Queen of the Night of the Magic Flute, outlawed Masonry entirely based on personal fears that the hysteria of the French Revolution, which killed many members of his family, was somehow caused by Masonry. Despotic rulers have a hard time perceiving the natural reflexes of an evolving public mind, conditioned by the abuse of tyranny, rising up too fast and without the means of self-control. Muammar Gaddafi certainly found out about that recently. But in the ancient world, there actually was a mechanism for dealing with this energy. What Freud's nephew, the creator of public relations, Edward Bernays, might call the group mind. And it was done, like Oscar Wilde's quote on art, or as the alchemists would say, the royal art, on two basic levels. There is a hidden ancient tradition that deeply connects music, ritual, and symbolism to the science of personal improvement, or to the art of perfection, using the tools of architecture, ritual, and symbolism to effect profound changes in consciousness. The concept of perfection has always been a threat to tyrants and dictators because it is based on the idea that without an intermediary and without any priest or authority, an individual could use reason to study nature and in the process connect with an infinite and immortal intelligence that dwells in themselves and is shrouded by what some might refer to as a veil of tears or a shroud of darkness. The esoteric element here is clearly seen to be in the service of a higher cause. The true great work of the alchemist comes to fruition in its first form in the political alchemy of the creation of the modern constitutional republican form of government, based as it is on the will of the governed and only made possible by the elevation through intellectual freedom of the individual. This can only happen when people are allowed to have meaningful relationships with others who share different political and religious beliefs. Looking at Mozart's Magic Flute, which is an esoteric ritual modified for public consumption, it's obvious that the combination of huge visual symbols with powerful music creates a state of wonder that gives the artist incredible power to communicate with and make suggestions to the unconscious mind of the audience. This was at one time a very private affair, as the public was not always encouraged to participate in the self-improvement rituals of the higher classes, important as it was to keep people dumb and dependent in order to better rule them. Caesar had his bread in circuses, and some of the less enlightening forms of entertainment we have today are no better and serve the same purpose. In the ancient world, there were inner and outer mysteries. These functioned as a social control system and revolved around key holy days in the year, based on the solstices and the equinoxes, moon cycles, and planetary cycles. That's how they told time. That would be like me having a watch. They would look up. The stories that were told to the public were usually different from the stories that the priests were told in their private education, and strict secrecy was always the rule. Plato, Pythagoras, and Socrates were all initiates in the greater or inner mysteries. And during the ascent of the Christian era, much of this ancient knowledge was lost or suppressed, as those who had less understanding gained more and more power. As Masonic scholar and former Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite, Albert Pike, says, fables and leading strings always have been and always will be necessary for children, but those who hold the strings must not themselves be children and listeners to fables. Burn not the holy images, nor demolish the temples. Men must have temples and images. But let us chase away the salesmen from the house of prayers. Let not the blind any longer be leaders of the blind. Let us recognize those only who know as teachers of those who believe. As I read these words of Pike, I can't help but think of the great and terrible disaster of the loss of knowledge. In the 4 separate times the Library of Alexandria burned, or in the destruction of Tibet in the 1950s, and the brutal attacks all over the world in the name of God throughout history, from the Spanish Inquisition to the Crusades and the slaughter of the Cathars. When I read those words, I think about how the common sources of all the world's religion, which are incredible, beautiful stories that reveal the human condition, the pain of our existence, and a colorful, diverse set of tools to transcend that pain, have often been reduced to violent fairy tales that are used to manipulate and control people through fear, divide them from each other, and justify war, tyranny, and oppression. Even the opposite of this, the atheistic-based philosophies of Stalin, Lenin, and Mao, as an extreme example, is based on a rebellion against an oversimplified and childish view of the divine. Thus, it is defined by the same infernal logic. Either God is seen as an absolute tyrannical monarch who loves you so much he sends you to burn in hell forever if you don't love him back, or God doesn't exist at all, and there is no middle ground. Or so many would have you think. This is a picture of me and my father. That's me. So, when I was just 13 years old on August 11th, 1994, my father passed away from cancer. I held his hand as I felt his spirit leave his body, and it had a profound effect on me. It caused me to start asking some hard questions. One of the most cherished possessions I have is a letter he wrote me near the end, in which he told me that I was free to believe or not believe anything I wanted, but if I chose to believe in a God, in his words, I had, quote, a moral obligation to believe in a compassionate God. He made a very clear argument for this, and talked in his letter about how certain extreme forms of religion cause people to see each other as non-human objects and create the rationale for massive violence, tyranny, terrorism, oppression, and injustice. My father was not a Freemason, but he sure acted like one. Like Mozart, he was a devoted Catholic. In fact, my father had at one time studied to be a priest at Paranol Seminary and dropped out because his Jesuit instructors could not answer his deep and penetrating philosophical questions honestly. He opted instead for a master's degree in philosophy and spent his life as a therapist and as a counselor, helping to improve the lives of people less fortunate than himself. It could be said that he was devoted to the art of perfection. Freemasonry, for many, is a way of balancing extremes, a way of creating equilibrium between highly contrary forces, both within the individual and the collective of society. It is defined as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. I have found these words to be so exact, so precise, that they almost hold the key to the entire thing for me when I apply them to everything I have encountered in the degrees. So I'll say it again. Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. This becomes critical when we look at the magic flute. It's easy to take for granted the fact that I can stand here right now and give this lecture and we can have this discussion. It's easy to forget that not too long ago, a free exchange of ideas, the pursuit of self-improvement or perfection, and living in a free society, a constitutional republic which democratically elects its leaders, was such a threat to the ruling elite that literally every single person in this room would be tortured and potentially executed for participating in this event if it were held just a few centuries ago in the wrong country. Music and art, symbolized by the flute and the bells in the magic flute, were one of the few ways to sneak in personal development and a critique of the rulers of the time. In 1795, the same year that Francis II banned Freemasonry, making the climate of brotherhood and enlightenment thinking that nurtured and elevated Mozart's genius suddenly go underground, Cagliostro was tortured by the Roman Inquisition and died. The great mystic Louis Claude de Saint-Martin was active at this time, and the Comte de Saint-Germain was also very active at this time. What we take for granted as the modern world was being birthed by a handful of luminaries and visionaries in a violent and bloody time of revolution. Brothers Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Paul Revere all did their great works at this time as well. But what makes all of this possible? What makes it even possible to have a nation capable of ruling itself through a constitutional republic? In Masonry, there is a process of self-development that attempts to answer this question. The individual, as an initiated, past, and raised Master Mason, is working towards their own self-perfection for the rest of their life. It's a concept brought to their attention in the 14th degree, and it's worked on in all the degrees. This word, initiation, simply means that something is beginning, it's starting. And so really, a Masonic initiate who walks out of the lodge after attaining any degree is just getting started, because they have a lifetime of study ahead of them if they want to truly understand this stuff. The word perfection has been used in many different places and times to symbolize a psychological process initiated often through ritual that leads one down a path of self-improvement. This is the process that Tamino undergoes in the Magic Flute. Within the collective of society, which can be compared to a great stone building, there are the individual stones, individual people seeking to become better, to perfect themselves, who hold things together. This creates a structure that holds a sacred space for everyone else to walk into and experience divine proportions. This is the spirit with which the ancient monuments were all built, as symbols of the divine appearing on earth, and as symbols of the state, as a large body of individuals. The great cathedrals of Europe are all built on divine ratios and proportions. They simultaneously reflect the patterns and movements of the stars and planets, the patterns and ratios of music theory, and the patterns and ratios of living forms, all the way down to the molecular level of DNA, in which two of the 5 Platonic solids, the dodecahedron and icosahedron, are seen to be linked together, providing a stable structure. This is described well in the alchemical maxim, as above, so below. Throughout history, there have been countless examples of great teachers, mystery schools, and philosophers who've been murdered, attacked, persecuted by those in power because they made the mistake of going too public with their teachings and energized too many people. There has always been a natural tension between kings and dictators and the people they rule. The work of preparing society for its own real freedom is a form of alchemy. This royal art of transformation is the foundation of the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and goes right back through history in an easily demonstrated line from the present day through to Pythagoras and beyond. There is a profound and quite literal reason for why Brother Goethe, the legendary writer of Faust, referred to architecture as frozen music. The basic structure of sacred architecture and music are the same. And both are expressions of a deeper structure, which can be discovered by looking up at the movements of the stars and looking inward at the structure of living forms. In Mozart's time, the characters in the Magic Flute represented real physical people who had as their mission the destruction of the fraternity, and with it the ability of a free people to think independently, all come together on the same level, regardless of creed, and build a harmonious society based on the consent of the governed. To anyone who thinks that today we may be able to sit back and say that these threats are no longer an issue, and we don't need to worry about tyranny, that we can work things out with modern politics, and that we're free to think and speak as we wish, I have some bad news and some good news. Even if that's correct, though I doubt it is, it wouldn't matter anyway, because if this is truly a Masonic allegory, then every single character is a part of the self, in terms of Jungian dream analysis, a form of analysis heavily influenced by alchemy, once again. After the March of the Priests, a very telling line is given when someone asks if the initiate is a prince or some kind of noble person. The answer is, more than that, he is a man. This says a lot. It says that being a man is more than being a prince. Like you, I have within myself an inner dictator, the queen of the night, ready to take over and appearing to be my savior at first. I have within me an inner enlightened high priest of Isis and Osiris, the character Sarastro, who is a benevolent, rational, wise ruler. I have within me a story that starts with chaos, as the first act is very chaotic and irrational, reflecting superstition. The second act of the story moves through initiations that take the story to higher and higher degrees of order and rational enlightenment. I have within me trial and error, the characters Tamino and Papageno, and they have the potential to make, as Brother Schikaneder says in the final words of each act, the earth the heavenly kingdom and mortals like the gods. In fact, everything I need lies dormant within my mind. And you're the same. By looking at Mozart's life in this context, we can see the intersection of all the most important ideas that led to the creation of what we now take for granted, a world in which individuals are free to discover their true selves, live with religious and political freedom, and create their own reality with a set of basic working tools shared by all, which allow every person to raise themselves up out of ignorance, conquer their own internal darkness, and fit their lives, like individual stones in a cathedral, into a larger meaningful pattern that can quite literally transform the world. Thank you.